Hello, good morning, everyone. We have quite a few participants that have registered and are still coming on, but I only scheduled this for half an hour, so we need to get through this pretty quickly. My name's Dominique Damian. I'm a safety director here with Washington Farm Bureau. And today we're going to talk about outdoor heat exposure and the wildfire smoke rules that are the current permanent rules from L&I. And this is being recorded so that we can get this on our YouTube and send out the link if anybody needs to recap or needs to catch up later on. So to get started, we're going to talk about outdoor heat exposure to begin with. This is the history of the rulemaking. So here in Washington, we've had a heat exposure rule since 2008. But back in 2021, L&I was petitioned to modify that rule. And so we ended up with emergency rules through the summers of 2021 and 2022. And finally, last year, L&I came out with a permanent rule effective July 17th of last year. And that is to update the prior one. So some key changes. The last regulation was effective May 1st through September 30th. This time it is effective year round. And the temperature thresholds, the temperature trigger points have changed. So it used to be 89 degrees for all other clothing. That's the major change, is that now it is 80 degrees for all other clothing. So this rule is effective year round whenever temperatures are expected to be 80 degrees or higher for all other clothing. 52 degrees for non-breathable clothing, which are like your pesticide, chemical resistant suits. The main takeaways of this rule: you're going to have a policy to begin with that reflect the current regulations that we're going to talk about here in a second. You have to provide water that is cool, sufficiently cool, and allow for rest breaks, provide shade, monitor employees for symptoms of heat-related illness, and have a plan to respond if somebody were to exhibit those symptoms. So here's the main elements of the regulation. Now, your written policy, pretty much the same thing as it was before, except there are just a few changes. You have to have a procedure for providing water. That doesn't mean that you have to provide all of the water all at the same time. You can supplement, or you can start with enough water to provide at least a quart of water per person, as long as you have a plan to replenish it throughout the day. Procedures for providing shade, procedures for acclimatization, procedures for a high heat response, which the acclimatization and the high heat response are new, and then close observation and emergency response. And by the way, because this is a webinar set up, if you have a question, feel free to put it in the Q&A section, and we will get to it at the end. I'm the only one monitoring currently, so I'll have to check it at the end, but we'll get to those questions too. So water, drinking water is suitable to drink and suitably cool in temperature. There are other acceptable beverages, including sports drinks, as long as they do not contain high amounts of sugar, caffeine. Alcohol, soda, energy drinks, those are not acceptable means of hydration. You have to have drinkable water that is suitably cool in temperature. And again, employers are not required to supply the entire quantity of drinking water at the beginning of the shift. They can begin the shift with smaller quantities of drinking water as long as they have procedures to replenish throughout. Rest. Just as always, encourage employees to allow them to take preventative cool down rest periods when they feel the need to do so. That has not changed. To protect themselves from overheating, using a sufficient means to reduce body temperature, such as shade or some equally effective mean. The preventative cool down rest period must be paid unless taken during a meal period that is not otherwise required to be compensated. If an employee is showing signs and symptoms of heat-related illness during the cool down rest period, you must comply with the emergency response part that we'll talk about here in a second. Employees are responsible for monitoring their own personal risk factors for heat-related illness, including the consumption of water and other acceptable beverages to ensure they are hydrated and taking their preventative cool down rest period when they feel the need to do so. But what the new rule says has implemented is these mandatory rest periods during high heat or during a heat wave. So when the temperature hits 90 degrees, the employer is required to provide at least 10 minutes every 2 hours for a preventative rest period. And then when it hits 100 degrees, the employer must provide at least 15 minutes per hour for cool down. And now there is a requirement for shade. There are other acceptable means besides just your typical shade. And what LNI defines as shade is a total blockage of sun. However, you can, instead of providing, usually that's the 10 by 10 pop-ups that you see here that we're seeing out in the fields. You can use, if you have a big tree, they are allowing it. How that does get a little bit more dicey, depending on the time of day or the size of the tree. You can use these misters here. You can use air-conditioned vehicles, but the air conditioning must be turned on. And so that's something that you may need for administrative controls to instruct to employees that if they're going to be using the air-conditioned vehicles, they will be, they do need to have the air conditioning on actually. Now also, so for the acclimatization part of the new rule, employers are required to, they say, closely monitor employees, newly assigned employees who are new to the heat or are returning after 7 days or more. Employers must closely monitor them for 14 days, or during high heat, which is 90 degrees or more, or during a heat wave, which is at the action level, or plus 10 degrees from the previous 5-day average. Not complicated at all. And so what closely monitoring means is you can use a radio or a cell phone, you can use a buddy system or some other effective means like using supervisors who maybe have a radio or cell phone and then can communicate to the rest of the crew. Now training, a few updates to training, same thing, these are the same things that you've always had to train before, environmental risk factors and personal risk factors. None of that has changed. The importance of removing PPE, the importance of frequent water breaks, the importance of acclimatization so that it takes up to 14 days for people that are new to the heat to acclimate to the current climate, and the importance of reporting during if anybody begins to show signs or symptoms of heat-related illness. It's also important to train on your procedures specifically for reducing body temperature. So what are you going to be providing the 10 by 10 pop-ups or the large enough pop-ups that everybody can sit in during their rest periods? And or are you going to do air-conditioned vehicles? Are you going to station misters around? What exactly you're going to do to allow employees to reduce their body temperature? And then your procedures for close observation. So how are you going to be able to communicate with employees? And then also the different types of heat-related illness. You must train for procedures for implementing your plan. So how are you going to, once you have your written policy, how are you actually going to implement that? And emergency response. Also, during emergency response, please remember that the ambulance needs to be able to find where you're at. That is not always easy for emergency services to find the people that they need to find. And then the importance of engineering controls, which that could be moving people into cooler indoor environments during high heat events. Because the severity of heat-related illness can increase rapidly, quick care is critical. To ensure employees receive the care they need in case of an emergency, employers must ensure that effective communication by voice, observation, or electronic means is maintained so that employees at the work site and their supervisors can contact each other to report the signs and symptoms of heat-related illness and get medical attention when necessary. So an electronic device such as a cell phone or text messaging device may be used for this purpose only if the reception is reliable in the area. Employees showing signs or demonstrating symptoms of heat-related illness must be relieved from duty and provided with a sufficient means to reduce body temperature. Employees showing signs or demonstrating symptoms of heat-related illness must be monitored to determine whether further medical attention is necessary. So have a plan on how emergency services will be able to find employees based on your location. So real quick, here's just a summary of the updates from the prior rule to the current rule. So from 2008 rule to the 2023 rule, the scope and applicability has changed as far as the timeline and the threshold or the trigger temperatures. It used to be May through September with a top temperature of 89 degrees, and now it is year-round with a top temperature of 80 degrees. The thresholds are down below. Rest periods, the prior rule didn't really talk specifically. It was implied that employers had to encourage employees to take rest periods as they felt needed. Now you have to encourage your employees that once they start feeling the symptoms of a heat-related illness to take a break before it gets bad. But it's also required during the high heat temperatures or during a heat wave. And then shade, same thing. There were no specific requirements before. Now you have to provide shade at all times employees are on at the work site. It's got to be large enough for employees to sit in a comfortable position. The amount of employees that are on break at the time should be able to sit in a comfortable condition under the shade provided and as close as practical to the employees. The policy before, that was a requirement. Now there's a few more specified requirements, including acclimatization and procedures for the emergency response. And then it also, something that also changed this time or last year was that it has to be in a language best understood by employees. To continue, acclimatization was not part of the requirements before. Now the current rule says that you have to closely observe employees for 14 days if they are new to the heat or returning to the heat after an absence of 7 days or more, and during a heat wave. The high heat procedures, there was nothing specific in the prior rule. Now, once it hits 90 degrees, you have the mandatory breaks and you have to closely observe employees. And then for the emergency response part of it, you have you have to have an established communication. Real quick, let me just check. Okay, so as we're ending the heat part of it, I do see that we do have one question that I'll go ahead and answer. It says, so shade must be provided all year round for all of the rest breaks, no matter the temperature? No. So this is only effective when the temperatures are expected to be 80 degrees or more, they added in that year round because we started seeing, October, we're still in the 80s sometimes. So they just removed those calendar timelines. But if it is expected to be in the 80s, you do have to provide the shade, even if it is October. And we have another one. For the acclimatization, will you be required to show documentation with the employees or just have the policy in place? So for compliance purposes, it does not say it needs to be documented anywhere. For purposes of being able to prove it, if an inspector does show up, of course, it's always better to have somebody or something that you can show to the inspector. So that might be just the hire date and your method of closely monitoring the employee up until that period of time. That should be sufficient. I hope that answers your question. Please let me know if not. All right, moving on. And then here real quick, these are just some heat resources, and I'll just hold this. I should have done this while we were answering questions. Hold this up here. These are some quick sheets from L&I. We do have a sample policy for both the outdoor heat exposure rule and for the wildfire smoke rule. We do have a couple safety meetings, just papers that you can use to help guide your training, should you need them. I don't have a way to attach it to this webinar right now, but if you email me, which all of our contact information I'm going to put on the last slide, we can get that to you. Otherwise, here's some other resources that you can use. You don't have to email us. All right. Gonna move on to the wildfire smoke. And I do apologize for going so quickly. I wanted to squeeze this into half an hour just because I know your guys' time is valuable and we are recording. So if you need to reference it again, you will be able to. So here's the L&I, the rulemaking background for wildfire smoke. Back in 2020, L&I was petitioned by the United Farm Workers to create this rule. And we, again, ended up with emergency rules through the summers of 21 and 22. And we now, as of January 15th of this year, have a permanent rule that is effective. So what is wildfire smoke? Let's start at the beginning. Wildfire smoke is the emissions from fires or wildlands or in adjacent developed areas, which is comprised of a mixture of hazardous air pollutants like particulate matter, volatile organic compounds, water vapors, and other gaseous chemicals. The thing that we are focusing on is the particulate matter, which represents the main component of wildfire smoke, which is a mixture of solid and liquid droplets suspended in air. The current rule is based on, the current L&I wildfire smoke rule is based on a 1 hour average exposure to particulate matter with a diameter of 2.5 micrograms or smaller, or PM 2.5. So this picture right here is just for reference. The human hair is about 50 micrograms in diameter. So you can see how small the PM 2.5 actually is. The problem with the particulate matter this small is that it can penetrate deep into the lungs. It can get through all of the human response systems and actually penetrate into the lungs. And wildfire smoke consists of about 90% of it is PM 2.5. So the rule, to simplify things, the rule references the air quality index as it relates to PM 2.5. And currently, so the AQI is a unitless index created by the EPA. Well, Washington EPA just updated what their hazard message is for each section of the AQI. So L&I is actually going back through and updating their rule to reflect the changes that the EPA made. I prefer to reference in AQI rather than concentration of PM 2.5 in micrograms per meter cube, just because it's just shorter. It's simpler. But it does confuse things a little bit. Just one of the things is AQI references not just PM 2.5, it's whatever's highest. So out of PM 2.5, ozone, there's some other factors in there that can contribute to AQI. However, if you use these resources, it will tell you what the main contaminant is. And if you know that it's wildfire smoke season, the majority of the time, the highest contaminant is going to be PM 2.5. So you'll be able to see, using these allowable sites, what the AQI is and what's making up the AQI. So for reference, I'm going to use AQI through the rest of this training. In the meantime, though, there is a DOSH directive that is providing interim instructions on how to use AQI and how that correlates to the current concentration of PM 2.5. And just for clarity, they're not changing the thresholds of the concentration. It's just this chart here that'll shift just a little bit. And if you are using the current rule, you will be in compliance, because they're shifting. The EPA is shifting, so it's a little less strict. So here is, I love this chart. This just makes this very simple for us. This is a complicated rule, and there are at different thresholds or trigger concentrations, trigger AQIs, there's different requirements, which makes this rule complicated. But this is a nice, easy chart that we can use to say, okay, where are we at? This is what I need to do. So when it's good, when air quality is good, really you just have to be paying attention. Is the air quality forecasted to be bad? Are we looking at wildfire smoke here coming up? You don't have to do anything yet at that point except prepare. So right now, while the air is good, we'll talk about what are the requirements that you can prepare for, like the next level up. So once the AQI hits 72, you have to have training and a written plan. So right now, when the air quality is good, make sure you have your written plan, make sure you have training, or you're doing training here soon. Then, as the air quality gets worse or the number increases, so once it hits 101, you have to have your written plan and training. You also have to provide N95s and exposure controls. And we're going to go through each of these. We're going to talk about each of these. So I'm going over this just as an overview real quickly. Then when the AQI hits 351, once it gets into this hazardous area, as the EPA says, then you have to directly distribute the N95s. So the first part is you have to provide them. You have to have them somewhere that employees know where they can get them themselves. When it hits 351, you have to directly hand them out to the employee. Once it gets worse, once we go up higher in this maroon section and the AQI hits 849, you have to require respiratory protection. Typically, this is bad enough. The air quality is so bad that you're likely going to send people home. But if you don't, the employees that are going to stay have to be prepared to wear a required respirator. And when respiratory protection is required, you have to do the medical examination and the fit test. And this so an APF stands for Approved Protection Factor. And that means a half-mask respirator that has been sufficiently fit tested has an APF of 10 or more. You can use N95s. N95s are technically half-face respirators. The only problem with them is they're hard to fit. So if you can get those fit tested, those qualify here. it's easier to fit test a rubber face piece respirator. Or the other options are you can use a air supplied, a positive pressure respirator. Any of the PAPRs, those are not required to be fit tested because it actually uses positive air. It doesn't rely on the fit on the face. Then when it gets worse, when the air quality gets worse and we come up and we're now at 957 or higher, if the AQI is higher than 957, now you have to have a respirator with an APF of 25 or more. And again, we're talking required respirator use. That means that you have to have a respirator program with medical evaluation and fit testing. And an APF of 25 or more means that you have to have at least a full face respirator and a quantitative fit test. So a qualitative fit test is somebody you can do yourself. Somebody will squeeze, you can get a respirator fit test off of Granger or somewhere like that. You test with something that the user, the wearer, can respond to. They either smell it or they cough or something like that. When we're talking about a qualitative or quantitative fit test, you use a port count and it measures the concentration within the respirator and the concentration outside the respirator. I mean, you can purchase a port count yourself. However, they are kind of costly. Otherwise, you can send somebody to usually like a Oxarc or something like that that can do fit testing. Okay, now to get in a little more detail about these requirements. So here's what's required in your policy for wildfire smoke. You have to talk about the health effects of wildfire smokes, information on employee rights to obtain medical treatment without fear of reprisal, how employees can obtain the concentration and how you're going to, the air quality and how you are going to communicate to the employee about the air quality and how they can communicate back to you. So it's got to be an established two-way communication method. You want to encourage employees to communicate if the air quality is worsening. Include the requirements of the WAC and your methods of protection, the importance, limitations, and benefits of respiratory protection, and then the use and care of respiratory protection. Remember that respirators can introduce their own hazards to the workplace, so that does take a little more planning too. And then communicate the hazards. So these now reflect the AQI of the rule that they are updating. This is more effective, or if you're using the previous rule that came out in January, you are at least as effective as the rule that will be coming out. But you have to communicate the hazards to employees. So you have to be able to inform employees of protective measures when you get 2 or more readings with an AQI of 72 or more, or 1 reading of a AQI of 101 or more. And then encourage employees to report when there's worsening air quality. If the availability of like PPE, if you're running out of N95s, you want your employees to report that back to you. And then of course, if they're experiencing adverse symptoms. For training, these are the elements that you have to train on: the health effects and symptoms of wildfire smoke exposure, the importance of informing the employer when the employee is experiencing symptoms of wildfire smoke exposure, the right to obtain medical attention without fear of reprisal, the requirements of the regulation, the employer's method of determining the current concentration, how employees can obtain the current concentration, and the employer's method of communication, the employer's response plan for wildfire smoke, including the methods to protect employees from wildfire smoke and the exposure symptoms, and the emergency response procedures, the importance and benefits and limitations of using properly fitted respirators, and the risks and limitations of using an unfitted respirator, and then how to properly put on, use, and maintain a respirator. Symptom response. For you as an employer, you've got to allow workers to seek medical attention and follow medical advice. You have to monitor employees displaying symptoms and take steps to reduce or eliminate control or eliminate continued exposure. And where the current exposure is at AQI of 351 or more, the employer must move employees displaying symptoms into displaying symptoms requiring immediate medical attention to clean air. So just real quick, here are some exposure controls at the various levels. At an AQI of 72 or more, employers are encouraged to implement exposure controls, not required, but encouraged, which could be moving employees to an indoor facility if possible. At 35.5 or an AQI of 101 or more, you have to provide some engineering exposure controls. Really, probably most likely it's going to be relocate or reschedule work if possible. Respiratory protections required at AQI of 72 or more. That just means that you have to, you can allow employees to wear respirators. At 101, you provide respirators. At 351 or more, you distribute respirators. And when I say respirators, I'm saying N95 filtering face piece respirators. If you choose the higher protected respirators at this point, you do still have to go through a medical evaluation. So when we're talking about N95s, you don't have to do the medical evaluation unless you require it. And then at 849, you must wear respirators and respiratory protection is required. And then at 957 or more, respiratory protection is required with an APF of 25 or more and P100 filters. So here's some more information if you need the regulation about wildfire smoke. And then here is our contact information. I know we're just a little bit over. I'm just gonna see if James or Riley, if you are on here, can you put something in the chat? Otherwise, does anybody else have any questions? Okay, I apologize, we're 2 minutes over. Again, this is recorded. If you want any, if you would like a copy of this or a copy of the recording, or if you want a sample program or the safety meetings, you can email one of us here at these email addresses or give us a call. With that, thank you for attending. And next week, we will be doing one specified for employees. So we'll cover the general information that employees need to know. It's not going to be able to cover everything because the employer still needs to let the employee know where things are going to be, like shade, water, how you're going to structure breaks, things like that. But we'll cover the signs and symptoms and general information regarding heat and wildfire smoke for the employee part of it. All right. Well, thank you very much. Have a good day.